Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to another episode of Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff. I'm here as usual with my co-conspirator, Dr. Ray Owen. Hi, Ray.
Hello, Rich. Good to see you again.
And you, mate. And yeah, my name's Rich. So we are going to talk about acceptance tonight. And before we dive into that, as we always do, it's nice to just catch up. So what's been going on in your world, Ray? What have you noticed since we last spoke?
Well, one thing I noticed was the death of a specific artist. And the interesting thing about this was an artist whose name I didn't know before. So an American artist called Drew Struzan died sadly last week, age 78. As I say, I'd not known his name before, but instantly people were announcing this. I recognise, like most people would recognise, Rich, I know you would definitely recognise his work, because he was a guy who did loads of the classic film posters from the 80s, the 90s, and through the 2000s that all were for different films but had a very similar look. The original Star Wars poster, Back to the Future, favourite film of mine, Blade Runner. I kind of hadn't noticed until these were all shown how much those posters meant to me.
That's completely passed me by.
A major Star Wars fan like you.
Yeah, there's a bit of trivia I didn't know. I didn't know who drew the posters. And I didn't know that the man who drew the posters had died, so that's passed me by. But I know what you mean. There's some really iconic images from my childhood that are just kind of etched into my memory, and there's a kind of instant access to a whole load of emotion when I see them.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That's the thing that I'd only thought about since seeing this a few days ago, is that, in a sense, a movie is a movie. It's the 90 minutes, 100 minutes, 120 minutes or whatever of action on some kind of a screen. For a lot of them, and ones that I think have probably mean a lot to a lot of us, there's a world around that. There's like an extended self of the movie about when you saw it, where you saw it, who you saw it with. We talked a little bit about this before. But I hadn't also realised that those images, for me, are a key part of that film. And they kind of summon up some of the feelings and some of the excitement that went with it. So again, not something I'd at all noticed before, but instantly accessible as soon as I saw these images in the context, sadly, of the artist's death. So we say his name again, Drew Struzan, who deserves more praise than perhaps was sent his way until he was no longer with us.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, it's nice to be playing a part in remembering him then. And yeah, an incredible body of work he leaves behind.
And what about yourself? What have you been noticing?
So I was a bit downbeat last time we spoke, I think. And so my mood has picked up somewhat because in a number of reasons, but in part, I went to an ACBS, so that's the Association for Contextual Behavioural Science. That's the kind of mothership of all things ACT. And it was in Poland, and I'd never been to Poland before. I was presenting and just going along as a punter and enjoyed lots of interesting new workshops with people I'd never seen before, some old friends and some new people. And I just got that thing that I always get when I go to a conference of it's kind of like a shot in the arm. It sort of reminds me why I do this job, why I love the other people who do this job, and the sort of stimulation of being around a community of people who are really passionate about trying to help alleviate the suffering of their fellow human beings. I think there's just something really wonderful about it. So the community was lovely. I'd never been to Poland, as I said, so I've never been in amongst a bunch of Polish people in quite the same way as that. And just marvellous. What a wonderful community, very vibrant, upbeat, just good fun, but clearly committed to the cause. So lots of interesting work going on there, and just generous to a fault. I mean, it's a conference in Poland, right? But they had at any one time there were two different things in English that I could go to. So there's that thing that I always have about feeling terribly embarrassed whenever I'm abroad that I don't speak any other languages. And yeah, I think they made that easy, and yeah, by putting all these different English speaking things on. So yeah, just great and just really lovely to connect. I know that you've been to the Polish conferences before. I never have.
Yeah. Kind of a few times. Absolutely fantastic community. I've long argued that though this therapy approach, largely started out in English-speaking countries, a bit of Scandinavia, that, for a while it's felt to me that Poland has been one of the real powerhouses of things moving forward. I'm glad you've had a sample of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great. I think in this year, so there's always an ACT World Conference, and this year it was in America, and I didn't want to go to America. just like I don't really want to go to Russia or North Korea. And so my values wouldn't really allow me to attend that conference. And so it was nice to go overseas to a different community and feel all the same things that one would feel at one of those world conferences. Anyway, acceptance then. So this feels like a fairly core topic, and I'm surprised given our interest in acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and it's in the name there, that we haven't covered this before. And so it feels important to do so. I was particularly inspired, I think, by the conversation we had towards the end of the last episode, where we were talking about your thought that you have of lacking self-discipline. And we did an exercise that very much tapped into the principles of acceptance. And I thought, well, we really need to dive into that in a bit more detail. I suppose one thing we should do first is kind of do a bit of setup as to why we think acceptance is a useful intervention or a useful skill for people to develop. And that, in my view, I suppose, and I'd be interested in yours, is that it feels kind of like a behavior that one could deploy instead of some of the more usual responses to discomfort. And if I think about therapy as being constructed in terms of a kind of, like if I say process, procedure, outcome, what I mean there is that there's a particular target problem, particular behavioral process usually that we are interested in trying to address. And we're doing so because it's problematic. And there's a procedure that we would do, so some kind of intervention. And then we would be expecting that intervention to produce some kind of outcome. And so I kind of think of acceptance as the outcome. That's kind of where we want to get to. And that implies that there must be some kind of process or target problem that acceptance is the more functional alternative to.
Mm-hmm.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, that seems clear.
Okay. If I were to kind of line you up then, what would you say is the problem that acceptance is trying to provide an alternative to?
The phrase we use for this is something called experiential avoidance. Okay, so I might as well start with the phrase because it kind of answers itself. It is avoidance of certain sorts of internal experiences. And those we're particularly interested in here, not exclusively, but we're particularly interested in ones that we might call emotions, what some people would call negative emotions. And I'm going to put sort of scare quotes around negative emotions here, because we're going to come back to the idea of, is there actually such a thing as a negative emotion? Well, things like sadness, fear, shame, guilt, anger, emotions that are potentially uncomfortable for us. The argument goes that many of us, most of us, maybe all of us, have a tendency to prefer not to feel them and to do things that either, when they're present, are behaviors that are built around getting rid of it or minimizing it, or behaviors that are organized around not feeling that way in the first place. So that's the concept of experiential avoidance. When you organize your behavior around trying not to feel stuff that you don't want to feel.
I always think of this as having like a really long evolutionary history. I think when I first encountered therapy and psychology, I was sort of taught quite a narrow view. I think that sort of avoidance is bad. You know, we shouldn't avoid emotions, that's just bad for you. That said, and I can kind of see why people said that. I think it's a bit rigid, but we have a really long history of avoidance, don't we? We have, all of us have a repertoire of avoidant behavior because it's just really functional and keeps us alive. So if, I don't know, a tiger's running towards me, for example, I'm going to run in the other direction. I'm going to avoid it. If I see something that I really don't like, I don't know, some rotten food, for example, I'm going to avoid that too. And I think what happens is that because we have a long history of running away from stuff we don't like, when things we don't like show up in our internal world, like, you know, horrible thoughts or uncomfortable emotions, we just use the same strategy. It may be obvious or it may be subtle, but there are, I think, many ways in which humans are good at avoiding their internal experience. I wonder if we could play a bit of experiential avoidance ping pong for a minute. You name a strategy that you're good at, and I'll do the same.
Distracting myself from something that's puzzling me or I'm finding difficult, and I suddenly find I have to do something else instead. So I'm no longer feeling that difficulty.
I think I intellectualize. So rather than feel emotion, sometimes I'll just go up into my head and try and think my way out of something.
Go to bed, go to sleep. I mean, not so often during the day, but just kind of like put stuff off until it's time to go to sleep.
I just fill the room with noise. So I don't particularly like silence if I'm on my own because, if my head starts getting a bit loud, I will put on a podcast, put on some music, just focus on that instead of the things that are rattling around inside my head.
I mean, maybe this is just another example of distraction, but I'll eat. I'll go and eat a snack or make a drink. I mean, not. I know some people do use alcohol in that moment. Fortunately, I've never been in the habit of doing that, but I certainly make a tea or a coffee just as a way of sort of distracting myself.
Okay, final one from me then. I think I'm not alone here, but I use my phone as a way of just sort of numbing. It's like, oh, here comes the bad feeling. Where's my phone? And I'll start scrolling on, something that I don't need to look at all. I guess this kind of defines experiential avoidance, isn't it? The only reason you're doing it is to get away from something you don't want. I could pick up my phone because, I don't know, I want to call a friend or I want to book some gig tickets or something that would be a value driven move. Unfortunately, I think I pick up my phone a lot of the time as what we tend to call in the trade an away move. The only reason I'm doing it is to get away from discomfort.
Yeah, so you sometimes hear the phrase, yeah, like you say, like an away move. So you're moving away from discomfort rather than towards something positive like gig tickets or understanding something better. And more technically, sometimes we'd say those positive things are things we have an appetite for. So that behavior is under appetitive control because it's to do with your appetite. Whereas that away stuff, where you're trying to get away from stuff you don't want, is under aversive control because it's being driven by getting away from the stuff we find aversive.
So if I were to press you and I can kind of hear some of the objections that I've heard from clients over the years, like, well, what's the problem? What's wrong with that? I feel bad. And so I do something and then I don't feel bad. Feels like,
Yeah.
that's a winning strategy.
And I suppose my response to that would be, yeah, you know, it's only a problem when it's a problem. So the example I would give is that going back a few years, when I was driving to work, I would have the Today program on Radio 4, like the top flagship news current events thing. I'd probably listen to PM on the way home if I was back in time, watch Question Time on a Thursday night, be really engaged with all these political issues. And I don't do any of those in that way. And the reason I don't do any of those is it winds me up too much. I find myself too angry, sort of shouting at the radio or at the TV or something. It creates very unpleasant feelings in myself. So in not listening to those current affairs programs or watching Question Time, am I doing experiential avoidance? Yeah, absolutely I am. Every bit as much as if I had a headache and I took a paracetamol for it. Is it a problem that I'm not watching those programs? No, it's not. I do pay some attention to news and current affairs, so I'm not completely ignorant of the state of the world's in, but it doesn't actually inhibit me in any way by not seeing those things. Now, if I was a political journalist or somebody who had a reason to be monitoring how mainstream media are covering politics, it would be a huge problem that I was being experientially avoidant. So it's not the form of me turning away from those programs that is the problem. It's the function or the consequence of it. On the one hand, it just reduces one source of distress while I'm still fully engaged in my life. Cool. But on the other hand, if I was a political journalist myself, then actually that experiential avoidance would be taking me away from something that mattered to me. And under those circumstances, then yes, it is a difficulty.
That makes a lot of sense. It's, as you said, avoidance is only a problem when it's a problem. Sometimes it's really functional. And I think that's one of the challenges of being a therapist, trying to help other people work out, is this behavior a helpful functional behavior or not? Is this something that's kind of enriching my life? and bringing
Mm.
me closer to the kind of life I want, or is it something that's taking me further away? And I guess the kinds of avoidance that we're talking about here, and I guess if people are listening, the kind of avoidance that we want to focus attention on would be the kind of avoidance where the only reason you're doing this is to make yourself feel less bad, and it kind of results in your life becoming smaller, and your life becomes about turning down the volume on the uncomfortable stuff rather than turning up the volume on the kind of good, rewarding, connecting, meaningful stuff in life. No, I've certainly worked with people whose entire life revolves around not feeling anxious. And I think, there's a nice phrase, I can't remember who came up with it now, but there's a nice one-liner in ACT that the problem isn't the problem, the solution is the problem. And so there's nothing intrinsically wrong with being anxious. It's a very functional, evolutionarily adaptive emotional experience. However, if you're anxious and, skipping work, drinking heavily, spending all your time on your phone, tuning out, going to bed, withdrawing from social contact in order to avoid anxiety, all of that stuff is the problem. Like the supposed solution to your anxiety is a bigger problem in your life than the anxiety. And if it were, anxiety option one, or option two, anxiety plus all that other stuff, I think it's a kind of no-brainer really as to which one is better. And so therefore, I think that kind of leads us into this idea that would some of us be better off if we could accept discomfort and kind of learn to live alongside of it and kind of have it with us as we go forward into our lives, rather than spend all of our time trying to fight it, control it, turn it down, etc. Does that feel like I've made a reasonable pitch for why acceptance might be a useful kind of additional skill to develop?
Absolutely, because what you're already pointing at there is that it's useful. It's a thing that leads to better outcomes. It's not that it's morally better. This isn't some simplistic view of what Stoic philosophers might have said, that, you've got to be tough in this world, like some sort of awful influencer on social media might, just tough it out, white knuckle it is the American phrase, isn't it? This is not what we're saying. What we're saying is it's when the avoidance gets in the way of you living a richer and fuller life, that's when it's a problem. And if that's a problem, then we need to think what the alternative would be. And that's where we begin to use this word acceptance, and we begin to use it in a very specific way, I think.
In the context of that, then, it probably does feel important just to say a few words about what acceptance isn't, because it's perhaps an unfortunate choice of word to put in the title of your therapeutic model because it has other connotations. And I've certainly worked with a number of people who have been quite resistant to the mention of it. I remember having one client who was just really adamant. I remember them saying, don't you use that A word again. Because I think it had connotations of kind of tolerating, just putting up with, resignation, defeat, waving a white flag, I've just got to accept it then, have I? I can remember another person who had experienced anxiety for much of their adult life, had invested a lot of time and energy and money actually in therapies that were all about trying to get rid of the anxiety. And I could kind of see us heading towards a problem. And I said, which was a little bit provocative, but I said, so you're saying you've tried for best part of 20 years to get rid of your anxiety and that hasn't really worked. And now you want to pay me to do more of the thing that hasn't worked for the last 20 years? And they said, yes. And I started saying, well, maybe that's not the way, that we should go here. Because if that would have worked, maybe it would have worked already, right? And I'm not sure we want to spend time and effort and more of your money doing something that hasn't been successful, hasn't been that helpful. Started talking about acceptance as an alternative. And I can remember for all the world, the look on this person's face was like, what's this shit? That I didn't sign up to this. This is not what I wanted. I didn't want someone talking to me about just sitting with my discomfort or accepting it. So I do think it has some unhelpful connotations.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. Do you have a different way of talking about it? Do you have a
Mm.
way that doesn't sort of invoke all of that tolerating, putting up with resignation stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I encounter exactly the same problems, and as a regular listener will know, given one of my key areas of work is in grief and bereavement, as well as sort of advanced illness, acceptance has very well established, kind of very densely connected other meanings in those fields. So as soon as you start using the word acceptance, it's not unreasonable that people think we mean something other because we haven't told them what we mean yet. So for that reason, particularly when I'm talking to professionals in those areas, I tend not to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy primarily. I tend to talk about the psychological flexibility approach, which is another completely legitimate way of talking about the area we're in order to get around that A word. Now, when we do sort of, for whatever reason, if we are using acceptance, I think the upside is that in the conversation about what that word already means to the person and what else it might mean, I think in the having of that conversation, suddenly new things can open up. So I don't think it's a disaster that a person walks in with a view that acceptance might be about giving up and we are going to mean something different with it because the exploring that territory might be part of the therapy. And it is also the case that sometimes I will still avoid the A word. So other phrases I might use are things like willingness to have. So the willingness to have difficult feelings and thoughts, if that's what it takes. And sometimes talk about making room for difficult feelings. Again, if that's what it takes to do something that matters to you. So those are some of the other ways of talking about this idea that I'd certainly use.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think if I could just enhance that maybe even further, that point, because I think I'm not a sadist, right? I don't have a vested interest in people feeling bad. So I'm not promoting acceptance because I like people to experience more suffering. And I don't want to create, an army of masochists who just inflict misery on themselves for no reason. So I think that there is a real link between willingness to have or making room for and concept of values that we spoke about a few episodes ago. And listeners, if you haven't heard that episode, it is a corker. So go back and listen to that. Um, but the two things to me seem very much connected because it's, are you willing to have discomfort in the service of pursuing this value driven life?
Mm,
Um, so
mm,
I don't know, for example, it's on my mind because it's the start of the academic year. We have a new cohort of students, and this is something I talked to them about on day one. They are engaging on a year long training program in CBT. It's going to be difficult. They're going to be outside of their comfort zones, learning lots of new concepts. They're going to be under a lot of scrutiny in terms of us asking them to submit academic assignments, or we listen to recordings of their therapy sessions. They are going to experience anxiety and shame and thoughts like I'm not good enough or I can't hack it or everyone else seems to get it much more than me. And it's important to sort of set that in the context that those thoughts and feelings are maybe worth having in the service of their professional development and them gaining this qualification. If it wouldn't be worth it, would it, if it was just there was nothing at the end of it? I just want you to suffer. There's
mm,
nothing good at the end. I just want you to that would be a terrible deal. For many of us, when we're practicing acceptance, we are doing it in the context of a kind of higher purpose, I suppose, or a value or something that gives us meaning and purpose. And
mm,
sort of invoke another classic act one liner, in your pain you find your values, in your values you find your pain. Nothing that's really worth having comes free, does it? There's always some kind of a cost. And I think we've probably talked about
yeah.
this before, but
And hearing you talk about your new trainees, takes me to a parallel situation where in training nurses and doctors to have very difficult conversations around illness, death, all of that, one thing that became very apparent to me was that the discomfort that can show up when you have those conversations, the sadness or the fear of getting it wrong or the embarrassment of not quite knowing what to say next. One thing I think is very common, certainly in healthcare professionals, I'm sure it's true in other people as well, is a kind of, I think, a belief that sits in there that if I'm feeling bad, then something is going wrong. So if we're having this really difficult conversation, so I'm telling you some really bad news and I'm feeling anxious about it and I'm feeling sad about it, the very fact of experiencing those emotions means that I'm doing something wrong. Therefore, the safest move, given, my first principle will be do no harm, my safest move is to back off from the thing that is causing that upset in order to protect the other person from harm. Which is kind of going back to the idea that we've already talked about of us treating our emotions as being sort of equivalent to being chased by a tiger or something. But the real problem, of course, is, as we're saying, for very important things in life, the price of doing them may well be the presence of these emotions, not simply as an unwanted side effect. Sometimes with difficult stuff that we engage with, they're a sign that we're doing it right, that we're taking it seriously, that we're fully engaged with stuff and that we're fully connected to another person in this moment. And understanding that isn't enough. There needs to be more that we can do, which we'll come on to. But having that insight is important if we're not simply going to fall back in on the old rule, which is starting to feel bad, I'd better back out now.
Yeah, I've always liked the notion of difficult or painful thoughts and feelings as being a messenger. What if they're not the enemy? What if they're not something you need to back away from? What if they're kind of like a messenger and they are telling you something important about the situation? If I think about my students, maybe something that came up when we were talking the other day was just the difficulty with scrutiny, that
Mm.
it's difficult to be observed. It's difficult to have somebody checking over the contents of your work, is someone over your shoulder. But it's only difficult because they really want to do it right. They want to do it well. If they weren't bothered about doing a good job and they weren't bothered about me approving of what they were doing, that's not the kind of therapist you want, right? You want someone who's bothered, someone who cares enough to worry about, am I doing this well enough? So I
Yeah.
think you sort of can't separate the pain and values pieces of life. Anything that's meaningful has some kind of a price tag attached to it. Oftentimes, that price tag is uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. And so, if you're going to pursue this thing, I think it is in all of our interests to learn how to sit with, make room for, develop a willingness to have discomfort in the service of pursuing the things that we care about.
And I think one aspect of that is, we talked before about some people's objections to the very concept of acceptance. Another one that's worth saying, particularly if we're applying this in workplace settings, is the idea that not just workplace settings, but any environment where a person is potentially being treated badly by others with power and influence over them. So that could equally be in a relationship. That if people are going to develop acceptance, are we not simply telling them to put up with maltreatment and just become sort of placid little victims of whatever is being done to them? And again, the associations of the word acceptance completely predict why that concept will pop up in a person's head. We've talked about how language does this kind of thing in previous episodes. This, again, is one of those areas where we need to be clear that we're generally talking about acceptance of internal experience rather than acceptance of this is how the world is and I'm going to allow the world to be this way. So to the extent that people working in active workplace environments, sometimes the question is put of them, yeah, you're not just doing that thing of making a compliant workforce who will submit to being overworked and abused by their management by teaching them acceptance and ideas that go with it, like things like mindfulness. Whereas the actual data that some of the people who run this have got is that people who've been through this training, quite the opposite, are more likely to speak up. They're more likely to defend their position and speak out when something's being done wrong because they're not as put off by their internal distress of doing that. So quite the opposite of making them compliant and passive, they become much more active agents in shaping those things that can be shaped on the outside, alongside or sometimes by virtue of being able to accept stuff that does show up on the inside.
That's a really great point. I was thinking along similar lines, like if I have a problem with my boss, let's say, and I know that addressing that is going to be really awkward and I'm going to feel anxious, or maybe I'm going to feel judged or scrutinized, or maybe I'm going to start worrying, what if they sack me as a consequence? If I can't tolerate those feelings, if I just can't have those feelings, then I'm not going to have that difficult conversation with my boss. I'm not going to sort of challenge the whatever problem it is that I'm experiencing. So absolutely, like a willingness to have discomfort in the service of asserting my needs or rights or whatever, that feels like a really useful skill to have. What I find myself coming back to, it's a little controversial because I think well, for one, it's a prayer, and so it has God in the title, and that rubs people up the wrong way. And it's associated with Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, again, something that rubs some people up the wrong way because of the kind of religious connotations that has. And so it's not for everyone. And I guess, though, you can give or take the God part. But this thing I'm talking about is called the Serenity Prayer. And it goes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I find the sentiment of that really helpful, because I think if I'm doing anything with clients, I think I'm helping them become their own therapist, I guess. We're weird, aren't we? One of the only sort of professions that works really hard to make themselves redundant in a person's life. But I don't want to be like the guru who's just telling people what to do. That's going to be no use to them when we finish working together. I'm more like the cheerleader who's just sort of helping somebody, make change in their life. And in the service of that, it's really useful that people can kind of track their environmental context and make a decision about, so this issue that I'm facing, be that an external problem or an internal experience, is this a situation where courage would be useful because this is something I need to change? Or is this a situation where actually acceptance would be useful because this isn't really something I can do anything about? And so sharpening my acceptance skills would be helpful. And so thinking about what you said about internal experiences, I don't think I have much choice over whether my, head says unkind things to me, or if I wake up in a bad mood, or I feel anxious in certain circumstances. I think I'm sort of programmed by my learning history to feel a given way in a given circumstance. I can't control that. So that feels to me like that's an opportunity for acceptance. That's the time where I can think, right, okay, I'm in this situation. I tend to get anxious in these kinds of situations. There's no point fighting that. I can't make it go away, but I can make room for it. As you said earlier, I can be willing to have it if having it actually might be helpful to me moving forward and doing something that might be, hard or anxiety provoking.
Yeah. And I think the example you've given there, Rich, is an excellent one. And it's an excellent example of something sort of leans into things that might not be universal. There's not many universals around, but kind of fairly widespread amongst people and cultures about things like attempting to do stuff that matters to them and suffering, but also the fact that how that is perceived and acted on is going to be shaped by culture. So, the very specific serenity prayer, you sort of mid-20th century German theologist, a guy called Niebuhr, found a way of embodying that within a Christian theology that's like an intercessionary prayer. It's asking for something from God to help you to do these difficult things, which, yeah, AA and people found really useful. And the same idea exists in other cultures, exists in sort of early Islam Sufism, exists in Confucianism, exists in the Stoic Greek philosophers, so it just gets expressed in different ways. So I think, personally, I think it's fine to take the general point of it. I don't need to believe exactly the same things as the Sufis. I don't need to believe exactly the same thing as sort of mid-20th century Catholic Church in order for there to be a deep wisdom in that as a way of approaching universal human suffering.
Sure. Just a little peek behind the curtain here. We tend to pass each other notes prior to making an episode. One of the things you've written down is Inside Out. So what's that all about? I'm assuming that's gonna
What's
be a
that?
reference to the movie, and if we've never plugged this movie before, we have been remiss because this is a great
Oh,
movie. What did you wanna say
we,
about Inside Out?
what I wanted to say about Inside Out, which often features on my kind of when I'm first teaching people about this approach, if I'm teaching fellow professionals, is when Rich, you said emotions are messengers. One of the things that you're saying there is that they have a function. They're there for a reason. They're there to do something constructive. In our lives, we tend to experience anxiety or disgust, fear, or anger as things we didn't really want. And there's certain sorts of biomedical approaches to this. They are seen as symptoms of something being wrong. The film, I think the original film's probably about over 10 years ago now. For anybody who's not seen it, and there might be some, who knows? This is my sort of recommendation of the week. You don't need to go away and read a textbook, just watch Inside Out. But the conceit
I
in the
would go
film
so far
is
as to say, if you haven't seen it, like, just stop listening to this podcast now, go and watch it, and then come
yeah,
back because that
and
in
then come
all
back.
honesty, that's probably a better use of an hour and a half than, listening to this. Yeah,
Almost certainly is.
it's a classic, yeah.
And the story it tells is we're inside the head of a young girl, sort of early teens. She's just kind of life's being interchanged for her. Life's not going so well because of family moving and stuff. What we see is like a cartoon version of inside her head, where all her emotions and psychological processes are little people wandering around. And and now here's the interesting bit: right at the beginning of the film, we're introduced to her emotions, and we meet first joy as kind of a central positive emotion, I guess. But then joy introduces us to the other key emotions, and she introduces each of them by function. So she says, "This is fear. Fear tries to keep Riley, the character, safe. This is anger. Anger really cares about right and wrong. This is disgust. Disgust tries to stop Riley from being poisoned. And this is sadness. And nobody knows what sadness is for." And of course, the movie goes on to explore what sadness is for. But the interesting point in that is that we're not given these unpleasant feelings as being symptoms of anything. They're actually being described as having a real use. It's just sometimes when our approach to those feelings is less helpful that things can get a bit out of hand. So that's Inside Out. Heartily recommend it. There's a sequel, Inside Out 2, which is equally good on these things. And that is our recommendation of the week.
Okay, so go and watch Inside Out, and welcome back for those of you that have just joined us, following your Disney Pixar marathon.
I hope you've dabbed the tears away from your eyes.
Oh, I was bawling the first time I watched that. I think, well, one, just because it's emotionally very sort of it's just very moving, isn't it? But I thought what a tremendous thing it was for a big budget Hollywood movie to have, I don't wanna spoil it too much, but to place such importance on sadness and the
Mm.
function of sadness and the function of like a range of emotions that we tend to not want to experience, to really just point out in such a kind of clever way how useful they all are and how we can't really function without all of them. We need them all. And it feels like there's a very, very strong acceptance message in that movie. And it's almost like the most ACT movie ever without ever mentioning ACT. But it just felt so much like it resonated with the way I guess I see the world and would like more people to see the world.
Absolutely. And if people do, having seen it, get the chance to see the second one, similar territories and goes further in exploring some specific problems, particularly around panic. So there is, again, without giving too much away, the character has basically a panic attack at one point in the second movie. I've come across several people saying that is the best depiction of what it's like to have a panic attack that they've ever seen portrayed anywhere. We should be on some sort of commission from Pixar.
We should, yeah. Right, let's stop marketing and make things more practical. So, I guess what would be useful before we finish up on this topic would be to perhaps, I don't know, describe or do a couple of exercises that tap into acceptance. Would you be up for doing something experiential?
Always.
Do you have a favorite? Do you have something that you
Mm,
think is a really useful kind of go-to exercise for trying to tap into this notion of acceptance?
I do, and in some ways, it's a variant of the thing we did last time, where kind of you were, anybody who's missed it, looked at a kind of a self-critical thought I had of myself and sort of pictured it externally. It's similar to that, but has a couple of crucial differences. I mean, possibly the easiest without taking too much time is if we do it live.
Sure.
Um, so if we were to, and if you, Rich, were to just kind of sit yourself comfortably, maybe eyes closed, take a few sort of settling breaths to come into the here and now. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is to think back over the last, I don't know, 24, 48 hours and try and land on something that made you feel a bit bad. Okay, now if there's been something super traumatic in the last 48 hours, let's not do that here and now. But try and find something that actually sparked some real sadness or anger or anxiety. And what I want you to do, without telling me what it is just play it through in your head. Just try and walk yourself into the middle of that. Either picture yourself back there then, or just if it's an idea, just replay the idea and why it bothers you so much. And in doing that, I want you to see if you can pick up in your body where some emotion shows up. Because emotions aren't just these words, they show up in our bodies. So there might be a sensation in your gut or in your shoulders, your forehead, whatever it is, even if it's only a weak signal because we're just doing an experiment here. Try and sort of focus your spotlight of attention on that feeling. So, for instance, if it's in tightness in the chest, turn the attention towards that and see if you can notice where the edges of it are. How big an area is that occupying? Are the edges of it really quite clear, or does it just kind of fade out? Is it constant or varying? Just notice that feeling for where it is. And notice any urge to be rid of it or to turn your attention away. But let's just see if we can turn towards it. And I'm going to ask you to imagine something. Ask you to imagine as you're breathing in and out, that rather than simply breathing in and into and out your lungs, you're breathing into and out of a space that's around that feeling. So imagine there's a margin of like an inch or so, 3 dimensions all the way around it. And as your breath flows in, it flows into that space. As your breath flows out, it flows out of that space. Now, what we're not attempting to do here is soothe it. Not in the sense of trying to make it go away or make it smaller or weaker. We're just giving it space. Here's your space. I'm not crowding you. I'm not trying to get rid of you. Sadness, fear, disgust, anger, whatever you are. I'm going to breathe around you and just make this room for you. And what you might find is that actually does fade a little bit. I don't want us to grasp onto that. I want you to actually build the feeling back up again. Think some more about that thought or memory. Bring it back, make it stronger, and breathe around it. Here you are. You're with me. Here's some space for you. I'm not squashing you. I'm not getting rid of you. And I breathe. And I breathe. And then whenever you're ready, you can let go of that image of the breath going into that space and just sort of breathe normally for a few cycles. And then whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes again. Without telling us like what you were thinking or what you were feeling. What was your experience of doing that?
It was interesting. I do tend to have this kind of narrative in my head, which is like, I can't do mindfulness. I can't meditate because I get distracted. And then I think I've figured out, I'm working on it, but I've sort of figuring out, I think that actually I can. I can do that.
Mm,
If I'm noticing being distracted, then that is just me being mindful and
it's you
tuning in,
being
so that's fine.
mindful.
So I was wrestling with that a little. But the thing I found really lovely about that was when you said, I forget the precise words, but it was something like you're breathing in some space for it. I sort of imagined like a little cushion, like
Mm,
you might inflate, a camping bed or something. That I was like, as I was breathing in, I was inflating like a little sort of cushion around
right.
it, to almost
Yeah.
kind of protect it. And then because I do tend to get a bit intellectual, but what was going on for me was, oh, like, what if this thing was what if it was a messenger? What if it wasn't the enemy? What if it's actually important and
Mhm.
actually it's sort of a bit kind of precious, right? And I need to look after it. That this
Yeah.
little inflatable sort of, I don't know, like a little raft that I was building for it with air. It kind of was like that was to kind of
Right.
cushion it and protect it, and it had a weird sort of transformation in my head that, like, it didn't feel painful anymore. It felt like, oh, it's just this difficult thing that's just but it's important, and so I'd need to look after it.
Mm. Oh, great.
Can I tell you this little story so this is where my mind went as well. So once upon a time, I was in Ireland, and there were some wild cats at the place I was staying, and one of them was pregnant, and so this cat had a bunch of kittens in the garage where we were staying. And over the next sort of couple of weeks, you could see these kittens sort of grow and get a little bit more adventurous, and you'd see them peeking out, and the minute they saw you, they'd kind of hide again. But there was one that was clearly wired differently, and it would go way too far too soon. So you would hear this sort of really high pitched mewling, and so the mother would have to go. Well, she didn't have to, but what I noticed that she did was she wouldn't like beat around the bush, wouldn't take a scenic route. She would go straight from the garage to the mewling kitten, pick it up, and bring it back and look after it. And it was just something lovely about. I thought, isn't that a nice kind of metaphor for how we could treat the more difficult parts of us? Because in some
Mm.
ways, you might think, well, that little kitten's a pain in the arse. Like, why doesn't it just behave like all the others, It was just very compassionate. It was like, right, okay, I can hear it mewling. I go straight, pick it up, I bring it back, and I look after it.
Yeah.
And I just keep doing that. Every time it plays up, I just keep doing that. And it was like, I thought it was a lovely kind of, yeah, metaphor for how we could treat the more difficult parts of ourselves. What if we could sort of see them as they just need looking after? So that's what showed up for me.
And that's very different from that urge, and and it is an urge, isn't it, to get rid of difficult
Yeah.
feeling. And this is the thing we always have to be really, really careful with people, with whatever technique we're doing, is it can be used for avoidance. So you could use
Okay.
virtually everything I just said as a way of trying not to think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do a couple of minutes of this breathing thing that Ray told me, and then I don't have to think about it anymore. Then I can ignore it. So lots of these things can be used as ways of ending it that end up with us trying to avoid it, ignore it, and then of course they kind of push back or seek our attention again. So that's I think one thing we've got to watch for with those. And the other thing is it is kind of a paradox. And the paradox is when you stop fighting with it, it does tend to get a little bit smaller. And the data is really clear on this, and it's the same with chronic pain. Oddly enough, we do all these things on the basis of we're not trying to get rid of our unwanted emotions. If you learn to do it, those unwanted emotions the intensity does go down somewhat. But if you try to do it in order to bring it down, you would be trapped straight back into the battle, which just adds petrol to the fire again. So sometimes, paradoxically, in my work with people, we'll practice these things and they'll come back and say, it's working so well, it's working brilliantly. Oh, what do you mean it's working well? Oh, well, I can distract myself much better. Or I can make myself feel better. And then, okay, that's good. And, we got to then be careful that what we're not doing is inadvertently finding a whole new set of tools for getting stuck in that same control cycle that hasn't worked before.
Would you be okay with like turning the tables? Because I really like what you did there. It's very different from the kind of thing I tend to not go straight to sort of meditative exercises. So the thing I had in mind is kind of different. If you got a piece of paper that you could write on both sides of,
I do.
so again, you don't have to share it if you don't want to, but I'd like you to get that piece of paper, and on the first side, I just want you to write like a troublesome thought or emotion. So something that feels kind of live for you. It's something that visits you frequently, gives you a hard time.
Okay.
So this is kind of a physical embodiment of that little one-liner I mentioned a while back, that in your pain you find your values, and your values you find your pain. So if we treat that as that's kind of like the pain, that's the uncomfortable thing. And then I'm going to invite you just to flip the paper over. And so
Okay.
on the reverse side of the paper, just like if these things, values and pain, do come like sort of two sides of the same coin, what would be the value here? So if I could ask you, what do you think you care about so much that it causes that thought to show up? Another way of thinking about this would be like, what would you have to stop caring about in order to guarantee that that thought or feeling never showed up again? Maybe I'll just like give you a quick example. Like if I get a bit anxious about teaching, even though I've done it a lot, because I want to do a good job. I genuinely want the time people spend with me to be helpful to them, and I
Mm.
care so much about it being good that I often worry it's not going to be good enough. And I think it's a kind of calculation almost. Like if I could say to myself, well, I don't care whether people learn anything or not, I think I wouldn't be anxious. So I think
Mm.
I'm only anxious because it matters.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the sort of I'm not good enough at this thought goes back to back with I want to be helpful. I want to do a good job. So that's like the pain and value sort of coming together. So you've got a couple of things on your piece of
I
paper. So
have.
one thing that represents
Yeah.
something painful, one thing that represents a value. And so we've sort of been prefacing this, but what if I sort of really explicitly just say to you that this is how it is, right? These two things, they go back to back on the piece of paper like this, just like two sides of the same coin. And there isn't really a way of separating them. The uncomfortable thing you wrote about, that is the price tag of caring about whatever it is you wrote on the back. And you can't really have one without the other. Wouldn't it be nice if you could somehow tear that paper right down its middle so that you could keep the sort of value side and get rid of the discomfort side? You can give that a try, but paper's really hard to tear that way. So what if I was to say to you, you've probably got a bin somewhere in the room or somewhere nearby,
Yep.
that the easy way out of the discomfort is you just rip the piece of paper up and you throw it in the bin. You've got rid of the pain, but the only catch here is that you would have to lose the value too. Would you do it?
Absolutely not. No, that wouldn't be worth it.
Well, that was very clear. Why so? Why did that come so naturally? Why did that idea that I wouldn't want to throw this away? Why did that come to you so quickly?
Well, because the thing that has been bothering me that I wrote on the first side of the piece of paper, slightly cued in by some sort of reading I've been doing, partly for a joint project of yours and mine, is the idea that things may be difficult in the near future in the world, or even more difficult. And so the thought occurs, well, that may impact my family and I can't do anything about that. So there's a thought I've been sitting with a little bit of late.
Hmm.
And then when you ask me on the other side of the paper to say, why does that matter to me? What's important about that in terms of values? Then it is, obviously, it's things like caring for others or nurturing. So when you ask me, could I throw the whole lot away so I wouldn't worry about the future anymore? But the price would be not to care for the people who are close to me and not to want to nurture them and play a part in their well-being. I'm not willing to throw those away. You know, in a sense, if I did, then I wouldn't be worried because I'm fairly old. I'll be gone. Not my problem what happens in this world in 30 years. I'm almost certainly not going to be here for it. But I'm not going to throw away those other things, not for one day.
Wow. Yeah, I found that really moving to listen to. And I guess that sort of cuts to the chase, right, of what we're talking about here, that if you are someone who wants to live a life characterized by caring for the people that you love, and the price tag is worry, let's first,
Mm.
just to call it that,
Mm.
maybe that's a price worth paying. Maybe the experience of loving people and caring for them, if the cost is, worrying on occasion, then maybe that's a cost worth paying. Imagine the alternative. You wall yourself off from people, you don't connect to anyone just in case you might worry about them. That
Mm.
sounds miserable.
And I've met those people, and I'm sure you have. It's sort of therapeutically, we've probably met them in our ordinary lives, but we would never know that about them. But in therapy, where people talk about stuff and we are allowed to ask all sorts of intrusive questions, yeah, we meet those folk.
So I guess, yeah, to sort of draw this together, I'm all about the cliche tonight, I think. But the other the other one liner that I do find myself coming back to is that just some things are worth suffering for,
Mm.
and some things not. And perhaps, life is all about just trying to figure out which is which. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to top that.
Okay, then let's not try. Uh, you ready for your question?
I am, I think.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
Your question is, if you could live with a fictional character, which fictional character would you choose?
Oh, that's a good one. Because we've already talked loads about things like Doctor Who, I'm not going to say the obvious thing, which is Doctor Who as played by Tom Baker. I think he would be a hoot to be around, to be honest. There's a character in the Pickwick Papers, which I just watched the TV version of, a guy called Sam Weller, who is like this sort of this serving man who is always on top of things, always has a really kind of upbeat way of looking at things and gets things sorted. I can imagine he'd be quite fun to have around. I'm not saying like as a life partner, but he'd be a useful guy to have around and quite uplifting. Do you have any thoughts on the subject, Rich?
You're thinking of him as like a roomie,
Yeah.
someone to hang out, a roommate, someone to hang out with.
Yeah, I'm not particularly wanting to go into alternate romantic partners.
So many ways to answer this question, aren't there? Yeah, I think I'm going to steer clear from the romantic partner way of answering this question, in case my romantic partner is is listening.
Quite.
See, now this is a problem that I have on a number of occasions, and I've even had in therapy sessions where I can't get outside of thinking about metaphors that involve Star Wars.
So if you had to have one person from the Star Wars universe who was your buddy and sidekick for life, who would it be?
This has surprised even me, but I think it would be Obi-Wan Kenobi. Just it's that kind of sage wisdom allied with just being very calm. I would do well with someone really calm around me. He's not gonna be the most fun you've ever had, but I think he'd be great in a crisis, and there would just be lots of little sage kind of tidbits that I would probably pick up on a daily basis, and I reckon bit of time hanging out with him, I would just become wiser and, more chilled, and that would be a good thing for everybody.
Sounds like an excellent choice.
I really should have thought this through. See, I'm getting the self-judgment now. It's like, why can you not just think of something outside of Star Wars just for once?
Because all of life is there. Why would he need to?
Anyway, there's maybe a place to leave it. I will go away and give it some thought. There must be other fictional. I'm sure there are other works of fiction beyond Star Wars, but I just for the moment I can't think of any. So that's my homework. It's been a pleasure as always. Good to chat to you, and we'll do it all again next month.
We will. See you then.